Dr. Kirida. Welcome to In Conversation.
Hello everyone.
Thai beaches are empty, but Thai factories are roaring full steam ahead. Didn't the pandemic hit all sectors?
No, actually, the pandemic hit the tourism sector in Thailand the most because tourists from abroad cannot come into Thailand, and tourism accounts for around 12% of our economic value or GDP. But of course, there's other engines of growth in Thailand as well. For example, exports, which is around 50% of our GDP or economic value, has been growing quite fast after the pandemic because major markets of Thai exports, namely the US, the European Union, and Japan and China, are recovering pretty quickly. So Thai exports to these major markets have grown very quickly. For example, last year in 2021, Thai exports grew by 15% year on year.
Thai exports are at a record high. I mean, this is close to what, a 10, 12-year high? So we are talking about a trend that has been coming on even prior to the pandemic.
Yes. Prior to the pandemic, the Thai exports was growing, but not as fast as the post-pandemic growth rates, actually. And that's probably because of a few reasons. One is because there is a higher demand for goods right after the pandemic, but also because of the US-China trade war. Many of the imports that the US used to import from China are now being sourced elsewhere. And Thailand is one of those countries that have benefited, from this sourcing of the U.S. To other countries. And of course, the Thai baht is now quite weak, so that also helps our exports as well.
So this is a curious kind of a pandemic bounce almost for countries like Thailand.
That's right. But even looking ahead this year and in the following year, for example, the US-China trade war will not, go away anytime soon. The Thai baht, according to many forecasts, will still remain weak and weaker than other currencies in the region as well. These are things that will last longer than just the post-pandemic bounce.
Thailand has become one of the biggest car accessory exporters in the world. Also things like pet food. Can you explain a little bit about which of the sectors really are doing well?
Sure. The ones that you mentioned are doing well. There are, automobiles and automobile parts and accessories. Those are doing very well because there has been a recovery, as I mentioned earlier, in the major markets for abroad for these products. And of course, food products, including pet food, is doing very well because as people work from home, increasingly they would like to adopt animals and pets, in their homes. And Thailand is apparently one of the top 3 producers of pet foods in the world. So we have actually benefited, from from people adopting pets at home at an increasing rate after the crisis, the pandemic. And also I would like to mention that other than these 2 products, hard disk drives are still the major exports of the Thai economy. And especially after the pandemic hit, more of us are working from home, more companies are allowing their people to work from home. So cloud computing is now really taking place, and we're into big data right now. So all these require hard disk drives. So hard disk drives are actually growing after the pandemic, and this won't go away anytime soon.
But what about the supply chain choke-ups? Why is that not the case with Thailand?
Definitely the COVID outbreak had some supply chain disruptions impact, but this year we forecast that will be less because Thailand has now vaccinated around 70% of its population, and many of the workers in the factories, many of the staff in the companies and factories are vaccinated. So the outbreak disruption will probably be less. The semiconductor shortage in the world has also affected the Thai manufacturing of cars. But again, the impact is not as large here because major big Japanese auto manufacturers in Thailand were able to secure the semiconductors orders beforehand, so the disruptions were not big for them.
You've been one of the lead authors for the Thai Economic Monitor, which is what the World Bank puts out. In all these years, have you ever experienced anything like this?
No. I've been, around in this, development field for 20 some years now, and I've worked with the World Bank for 15 years, and I've worked with the Thailand Development Institute now for 6 years, and I've not seen anything like the COVID-19 pandemic, which has prompted different countries to adjust themselves very quickly, including Thailand as well.
Not even compared to things like the Asian currency crisis.
Right. In terms of the impact, the Asian financial crisis had a bigger impact on our economy because in 1998, if I remember correctly, the Thai economy contracted by 10%. But in this pandemic, in 2020, the Thai economy contracted by 6%. But the difference between that crisis and this crisis is that the mass, the lower income households are more severely hit than the higher income ones, because when there are lockdowns of economic activities and when people can't go out to work, it's the lower income households that are really affected. So this crisis is definitely on the social front, it's bigger than the impacts are bigger than the Asian financial crisis.
We are seeing a trickle of tourists coming back into Thailand in this 2022, but it's not anything close to the 40 million visitors who used to come. What is Thailand going to do with such a drastic drop-off of such a large part of the GDP?
Well, we are pretty much hit by this drop in tourists. And this year, in 2022, we're expecting only 5 to 6 million international tourists in the country. There are estimates and forecasts that, by the time we reach back to 40 million tourists, it will probably be another 3 years from now. So it is going to be a very long, and dry wait for the tourism industry. So many of them, have actually adjusted themselves, to do other business at the moment because there is no demand at the moment. But big hotels, of course, are still in operation, but they have dropped their prices, for example, and they have made themselves, for example, quarantine hotels, for tourists or for Thais who are returning from abroad. So all the industries and businesses that are related to tourism are really trying to adjust themselves at the moment to do something else.
Chinese tourists were some of the biggest visitors in terms of numbers and also the biggest spenders in Thailand. So what do you think is going to happen with a zero COVID policy still in place in China?
That's right. So in our forecast, Chinese tourists will actually be allowed to leave China only at the end of this year. So it will be a very long wait for most countries that rely on Chinese tourists, and which is why our estimates for tourism in Thailand this year is only 5 to 6 million international tourists. And of course, our forecast suggests that even next year, there won't be the same number of Chinese tourists returning to Thailand because they are also affected by the pandemic, and of course on the supply side it's not as convenient to fly out, and on the demand side they will have to also mine their purchasing power as well. So it will take a while before the 13 million Chinese tourists who used to come to Thailand would come back. So it would probably not be until probably the end of 2023 or even 2024 before we see the high numbers.
Hasn't the really bad way that tourism has been affected given everybody a little bit of food for thought? I mean, if we look at developed countries like Japan, tourism actually only constitutes about 2% of GDP. Do you advise the Thai government to rethink how much they really want to, keep tourism as a very big component of the GDP?
Well, actually, tourism has been, a big part of our economy, and it has a big distributional impact because when tourists come, they spend, and there are trickle-down effects to other parts of the country as well. Although tourists usually come to only 6 or 7 major destinations, but of course, if they buy food or if they, buy retail goods, other parts of the country that produce these products, also benefit. So there's a good distributional and trickle down effect of tourism, and especially that many Thais can participate in this sector as compared to the manufacturing sector or export sector, which is very capital intensive, and only a few employees are hired in that sector. So actually, tourism is a sector that I wouldn't advise the government to reduce its size. But what I would advise is to increase the value of tourism services here in Thailand, so that each person who provides a service can get a bit more income from tourism. For example, I would just say instead of serving low-end tourists, backpackers, for example, if we could move our skill sets to more of like wellness or medical tourism, that will actually bring in more income to the service providers from each tourist. So that's something that I think Thailand could think of moving, meaning moving to higher end tourists instead of just focusing on the low end ones.
So you're saying that the heyday of these, as you say, 40, 50, 60 million tourists coming into Thailand, that's gone, that's over?
Well, I don't think it's over in the short term. I think in 2 or 3 years, there will be 40 million tourists coming back into Thailand. But I just worry that if these numbers keep growing in the future, these mass tourism that rely on a cheap labor and are not concerned about the environment, if that number keeps going up to 50 million, for example, or 60 million, it would put too much pressure on the Thai tourism in terms of its sustainability, because of the environmental degradation that would result from those mass tourism.
Normally, the ones that we think of, the people who are relocating, the factories that are relocating to Thailand, are Japanese, Americans, Europeans. Sony, Panasonic, they've been moving their factories to places like Thailand. But what I was interested to see is that Chinese factories are also moving to Thailand. Now that's fascinating. How come?
That's right. That's right. Well, Chinese companies are now looking to relocate out of China for a few reasons, right? The wages in China have been rising for a few years now, and secondly, because of the U.S.-China trade war, there are good reasons to produce out of China if they want to export to the U.S. or to U.S. allies. And of course, now that the Chinese government is more, looking at the private sector more closely and are trying to, control a bit more, of the production in the country, many companies, many Chinese companies are actually looking, out of China for alternative places to produce. And of course, Southeast Asia is one of their favorites because we're close to them. And of course, we have a many good relationship with our trading partners, including free trade agreements that many of our Southeast Asian countries have signed on. So, it's beneficial for Chinese companies to move out of China to Southeast Asia. For example, in Thailand, we have seen many investments from Chinese companies into the auto and auto parts industry because now, electrical vehicles are in trend. And many of the Chinese manufacturers of electric vehicles are moving to Thailand to produce the vehicles and also to produce batteries and other parts as well.
The interesting thing, though, is we tend to think of, Thailand as a middle-income country. I mean, Thailand is the second biggest economy in ASEAN. So is there really such a big, at least wages benefit? Because Thailand and Thai workers are not that, so to say, inexpensive anymore.
That's right. We will not get any advantage, in producing low cost or labor intensive products because labor costs in Thailand have been rising for many years now. So when we see the trend of relocation from China, for example, it's pretty clear that those that relocate to Thailand, whether they be American, Japanese, South Korean, or even Chinese companies, come to Thailand to produce products that are more high tech. So cars, auto parts, hard disk drives, petrochemical products. But if they were to produce labor intensive products, they would go to Vietnam, for example, because wages are cheaper there.
Do you think that Vietnam is going to end up being the one that soaks up a lot of the relocation and in fact, in a way, takes something away from Thailand? It ends up being the competitor to Thailand.
We have seen in the data that most of the relocation from China has gone to Vietnam, and Vietnam has taken, production all the way from shoes to toys to tablets. So it's a wide spectrum of production that Vietnam can accommodate due, to its cheap labor, but at the same time, also there's skilled labor who can produce high-tech products as well. But for Thailand, we're the #2 recipient in ASEAN in terms of the relocation in China. And most of the relocation that came to Thailand were in the more like semi-high tech or high tech industry. So on one hand, yes, Vietnam, is attractive. But at the same time, Thailand has other advantages that investors see, especially in the more high tech, the more green, the more low carbon, environmentally friendly production.
Let me bring you back to output exports here in Southeast Asia, but particularly, of course, in Thailand. China has traditionally been called the factory of the world. But with all of this relocating to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN, could we be the new factory of the world?
Definitely, we could be the new factory of the world, given that many of the producers of the world, the Chinese, Japanese, American, and also Europeans are looking to produce in ASEAN because we are actually a big supply chain that has been around for many years. But at the same time, we have good relationship with many trading partners around the world, and we have many free trade agreements as well. So it's pretty easy to produce goods in this region and export to countries around the world.
But what about the political element? Some of the more right-wing elements in the US argue that relocating to Southeast Asia is just a way of getting around tariffs on China.
That's right. That's right. It's very important that we do balance, between the two big powers of the world. But of course, the U.S. also has a lot of interest and benefits that they can get from being, a producer in the region as well. So I think, we will have to balance both powers very carefully so that the interests of both, are met, so that, they are not going to sort of penalize any of the countries, for exporting to their countries, or, accepting a lot of relocation from certain countries. And I think, if we can navigate and balance, those powers, we can definitely be the new factory of the world in this region.
Not easy though.
Not easy, but it's doable. And I think, it's going to be in the interest of the two superpowers as well, to be able to, produce in this part of the world, and, and export to other countries. So if we can play to their interest, I think, it's doable that we can be a production hub here, in the region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirida, for being on In Conversation.
Thank you for having me.